A couple of years ago I did my very first proper controller review, and it was Retrobit's tribute controller for the N64. It was Retrobit's remake of the HurryPad Mini that came out all the way back in the 90s, and it was a cheap and cheerful controller at only about 20 quid, which, despite its flaws, actually performed really well. Well, now 2 years later they're now up in the ante and they've released a wireless version of the same controller. Let's give this a run through its paces and just see how well it fares with its wired brethren. Hello fellow gamers, and is this the greatest N64 controller in the world? Or is it just a tribute? So just to recap, a couple of years ago, Retrobit released their wired Tribute 64 controller. This was heavily based on the HurryPad Mini, which was a very popular third-party alternative to the original N64 controller back in the 90s. Now, although it has its shortcomings, it's been my main N64 controller ever since. It's been really nice to use. Now, Retrobit have gone ahead and released a wireless version of this controller, which is a continuation of their Platinum range, but its wirelessness isn't the only difference. After having used this for a while, it is very clear that they've taken some feedback from the community over the original in order to try and make this one a much better option. So let's have a look at this thing, and can anyone be arsed with unboxings these days? There we go. So inside the box you get the controller, you get a USB Type-C cable, and you get a couple of dongles. One for the N64 and one for USB. So this isn't just for the N64, you can use it on various USB enabled devices as well. Now we'll just quickly go over the controller itself. I've got the original here for comparison, and it is noticeably wider than the original, and I've got to say it does fit into my bigger hands better. It certainly feels as though it'd be more comfortable to use in long run. It has the same GameCube-like joystick as the original Tribute 64, which is very welcome. It moves very smoothly all around, and its rubbery top gives your thumb plenty of grip. Now, one problem with the original Tribute 64, which in fact was brought to my attention after I'd released the video on it, was that the joystick, it doesn't really reach the gate fully when you're pressing right. You can see what I mean here. It's reaching all of the edges of the outer gate of the joystick, except for the bit on the right hand side. Thankfully, this has been fixed with the wireless version. All of the main face buttons are accounted for again. Now, one thing that I praised the original for was having buttons with a tactile feedback that was actually rather similar to the official controller. The buttons on this one though, they seem to be a bit on the clicky side. Now, I guess these will soften over time, but the original really did recreate the original tactile feedback of the official N64 controller, even if they were a little bit on the small side. Now, another criticism I had with the original Tribute 64 was the D-pad. It was way too small and it was way too central. I asked that they move it to the left hand side. Well, they've gone ahead and moved it to the left hand side a bit. Definitely a welcome change. It's a much more comfortable position, except the D-pad that they've used it's kind of on the narrow side, you know? I would have preferred a fatter D-pad, like what you find on the 8-bit door or the Retro Fighter controllers. And no, that's not because of my sausage thumbs. Another complaint I had with the original were the shoulder buttons. Now, the previous one came in two variants. There was an N64 version and a USB version. The USB one had the shoulder buttons all labelled, the L, R and the Z buttons were all labelled, but the N64 one didn't for some reason. And the problem with both of them was that they were just too far down the sides of the controller, so if you wanted to press them properly, you were having to hold the controller in a strange crab-like position. Now, this is something that they have definitely improved this time round. First of all of the shoulder buttons are labelled, so you can tell which is which now. And they're also a little bit bigger than before, and they've been moved further up towards the top so they're easier to press. One criticism I have at this point is that Overall, the controller feels very light in my hands. There's very little weight to it. Now, admittedly, it does weigh roughly about as much as the original in my hands, but the thing is, the original could have a rumble pack added to give it a bit of weight. This one doesn't have a port on the back at all. There's nothing to see on the back here. There is nothing there, so there's no port for memory packs, no port for rumble packs. So, how do you use them? Well, you use them in the N64 receiver. You plug the receiver into the controller port you want to use, power it up, and once you've paired them up, you're free to connect a memory pack to it and just use it as normal. But what about the rumble? How are you supposed to feel the full immersion in Lilac Wars and GoldenEye 007? It's just not the same without that rumble. Well, you'll be happy to know that unlike other wireless N64 controllers, this one has the rumble built in. No rumble pack, no batteries required. But it's here where things take a bit of a turn. And no, I don't mean its incompatibility with the transfer pack. Pretty much every third-party N64 controller fails to support that. There's a tiny little switch on the receiver so that you can switch between using a memory pack and a rumble pack. To use the rumble, you need to flick the switch over to the rumble position. Now that seems fair enough, I guess, given how many of these games were made. I've seen this screen plenty of times asking me to switch packs if I wanted to use the rumble. Except you don't just flick the switch. Oh no. You have to remove the entire receiver. Yep, you heard me right. The entire receiver. If you want to switch from memory pack to rumble or back again, you're going to have to either power off the N64 or remove the entire receiver from the controller port before making that change. Now, if you're playing a game which uses only one or the other, you're going to be fine. Just set the switch first before turning on the N64 and you're good to go. But games like Forsaken and Quake, they use both. You're asked before every level to put in the rumble pack if you want to use one, and you can't save until the receiver has been disconnected, switched over to the memory pack position and reconnected again. With games like these, you're going to find yourself constantly unplugging the receiver several times during play. Now the thing is, despite the fact that this will cause additional wear on the receiver and the controller port, this is a wireless controller. You can use it up to 30 foot away, but what's the point if you have to get up off your ass to mess around with the dongle after every level? Now hopefully this can be fixed in a firmware update, which Retrobit tells me will be possible for both the USB and the N64 receivers in the future. And I guess in order to do that you'd connect them up to your computer. But this actually raises another question. The controller itself has a Type-C port, and Retrobit were kind enough to include a cable for that, so you can charge up the controller or even use it as a wired one if you need to. But the N64 receiver has a micro USB port. Why? Why not use Type-C or micro USB for both of them, so you can just use the same cable for them both? Now I've asked Retrobit support why this is, but they couldn't give me an answer straight away, and the question is currently pending with their development team. I suspect it's probably cost. Because at £32, this is actually quite reasonably priced for what it is. Now with all of those negative things aside, otherwise, it is a very good controller. It's very comfortable, the buttons and the D-pad are in a much better position compared to the original, and more importantly, there is no discernible lag in the wireless connection either. I was able to play through a whole bunch of my classic N64 games, and I hadn't encountered any issues with the connection at all. Oh, but here I am talking about it being just an N64 controller. You can actually connect it to USB-enabled devices as well, so I gave it a whirl on a few of them. Using the USB receiver, it works pretty much right out of the box on a switch, though you'll need to make sure that the Pro Controller wired communication option is enabled. And once it's connected, the switch just recognises that as another Pro Controller. And after using it on a couple of titles, it seems to work fine. Works fine, as long as you don't need that second analog stick, of course. And something else that's really handy for the Switch, there are two extra grey buttons on the top of the controller, which can be used for the home and screenshot buttons. Now if you wanted to have a play around with any of the button mappings, the controller actually does have a number of macros available, so you can change the button layout. It's even got an all-star mode, so it maps the buttons perfectly for Mario 64 in the 3D All-Stars collection. And that controller setup even works for Sunshine as well. With regards to the PC and Mac, it should work just perfectly fine. You may need to change some of the button inputs, but after that, you're good to go. As well as being a decent controller for some classic indie titles, it should pair up really nicely with any N64 emulator you might be using. Now in the instructions it says it works on a PS3, but I haven't had any luck getting it to register. I synced up the controller to the receiver, it's recognised it, but none of the inputs are recognised by the PS3 at all. However, something that I did notice was when I then connected the PS3 controller afterwards, it registered itself as a second controller. So, I don't know, is there a step I've missed here? And sadly, this will not work on a PS4 or an Xbox One. The latter actually is a great shame, as this controller would have paired up really nicely with all of the N64 classics that were featured in Rare Replay. You know, stuff like Banjo-Kazooie and Perfect Dark. I also tried it on my Raspberry Pi running RetroPie. It did take me a couple of attempts to get the buttons mapped up properly, since it's missing a few, as well as a joystick, but once it was set up it worked just perfectly fine. And look at this, I'm playing a Dreamcast game with an N64 controller. Nuts! So is this controller for you? Well, the controller itself is actually really good, it's really comfortable, whilst it's still giving a nice nod towards the HoriPad Mini, which is what it's ultimately based on. And it's at a decent price point too. Now, I wouldn't recommend this as a typical USB controller, as there are others in the same price point that do offer a bit more. You know, like a second joystick or motion controls for example. But as a wireless N64 controller, it's quite a solid choice. It's been really nice having the whole untethered playing experience on a 90s console for a change. There's only a couple of viable options for wireless controllers for the N64 at the moment, and this one does tick many of the right boxes. The biggest issue for me, however, is how that N64 receiver works with the memory and rumble options. Having to unplug the receiver or turn off the console every time to make the change between the two is just an absolute ball ache. Here's hoping that a firmware update will resolve this. And yes, it probably is the only wireless N64 controller on the market today that has rumble built in, but it doesn't matter how good the controller itself actually is. Until they sort out that N64 receiver problem, I would say approach this with caution. But hey, if you're still after one of these, I've left a link in the description to where I got mine from. I'm waiting on more third-party retro controllers to be delivered in the near future, so I'm going to be doing more videos like this soon. And if you want to see how those turned out, feel free to subscribe down below. And here's a question for all the commenters out there. What would be the first N64 game that you would play with this controller? Let everyone know down below in the comments. But that's it for now, I'm going to sign off, so thanks very much for watching. Please leave a like if you liked the video, and I'll catch you all next time.